This is NatSec Matters.
I'm host Michael Allen with Beacon Global Strategies. Today I'm joined by Mr. Zack Cooper, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Before joining AEI, Mr. Cooper was the senior fellow for Asian security at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Cooper joins us today for a discussion on the current dynamics between the United States, China, Japan, and South Korea, as well as the policy outlook for the region. Stay with us as we speak with Zack Cooper. Zack Cooper, welcome to NatSec Matters.
Great to be here. Thanks, Michael.
Well, we're glad to have you. We're going to talk about China. We're going to talk about alliance dynamics in Asia. We're going to talk about what our China policy is and what it ought to be. But let's go straight to the Trump administration. We're many months into the administration. Is Trump's China policy becoming clearer, or do you think it's kind of on hold and in development?
I don't think it's particularly clear what the policy is at the moment. And I think we've had maybe two stages. There was a stage from January through April, which was pretty confrontational. We had tariffs, almost up to 150%. And then since then, the Chinese put on some restrictions on rare earth magnet access to the rest of the world, including the United States. And the president seems to have really backed off. And so I think we're in the second cycle now where the president has frankly given concession after concession to the Chinese, trying to get an in-person meeting with Xi Jinping in China. And as we just heard a few days ago, that looks like it's not even going to happen until next year. So I think we're in probably phase 2 of the second term in terms of dealing with China. But I bet we're going to enter a phase 3 at some point, which is a real downturn in the relationship. It's just a question of how long that takes.
And why is that? Because Trump seems like he wants a good relationship with Xi Jinping. I have not seen many of the items that, let's call it, the China hawk community would like to roll out. Of course, we had the trade stuff, and that's significant, and I don't want to downplay it, but it feels like President Trump is striving to have a working relationship with Xi Jinping.
Michael, I don't know what you think about this, but my sense is that the president really thinks that part of being a great statesman is having good relations with the top leaders in the world. And he puts Xi Jinping on a pedestal. He frequently calls him brilliant, really smart, good friend. And so I think that personal relationship really matters to the president. And I also think that he wants a photo op with Xi Jinping again, probably in China. And he's willing to give up a lot to get it. We've had TikTok, we've had a back down on tariffs, we've had a back down on the sale of some semiconductors to China and other export controls. We've got a series of actions on Taiwan. All of those things in the last couple of months have, I think, been designed to keep the door open and do things that the Chinese wanted. The unfortunate thing is that despite all of those concessions, Trump hasn't gotten the one thing he really wanted, which was this meeting. And so I think the Chinese feel like they can keep going back to the well and push this meeting off longer and longer and get more and more out of the president.
Yeah, there seems like they're playing hard to get. But just to be clear, the president is going to have a meeting with Xi Jinping this fall. It's not the one he wants in Beijing with pomp and circumstance, right?
I think that's right. So it's not 100% clear where that meeting will happen. So most likely it's going to be in Korea, but whether it happens at Seoul or at the actual location where the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit is going to happen, that's not clear yet. But, I would expect this to be a pretty quick meeting, especially if they end up doing consecutive translation. An hour or two can go by very, very fast once they get their opening statements out of the way. So this will probably be more of a pro forma meet and greet than any sort of substantive meeting.
Okay, so we want out of them a big meeting. Are there any other, and we want to, of course, get some concessions on the trade side. Before we get to what they want of us, and I think some of that's Taiwan, what else do we want out of China?
Well, what I think we should want are some structural changes in the relationship, right? You know, the president talks a lot about wanting to address the trade imbalance. I think what we've asked for so far are things that superficially address the trade imbalance, like getting the Chinese to buy more soybeans or aircraft engines. But the fundamental issue of Chinese overcapacity, that is not being addressed in the negotiations, as I understand it. And I think that should be priority number one for us. We could have a long discussion about what we should be doing on the security side. But I think, you know, for the president who prioritizes economic issues, you would think that getting some real solutions on Chinese overcapacity, and that would be priority number 1, 2, and 3.
What does China want out of us?
Well, I think they've been pretty clear, and you know, they tell some of us privately some of the things that they would like. One of the top items is some concessions on Taiwan. I think they would like the administration to stop selling some weapons to Taiwan. Another is a restatement of U.S. policy on Taiwan. The Chinese government seems to think that they may get the administration to say that the U.S. outright opposes Taiwan independence rather than just does not support. And I think it's pretty clear that the Chinese are pushing hard for some concessions on Taiwan, and that they're actually getting some concessions, at least since, let's say, the early summer.
So let's talk a bit about the compare and contrast from the first term. Just at a macro level, I think people say frequently at the beginning of Trump's first term, he was still sort of getting used to the job, and he had maybe had some establishment Republicans. He was happy to go along with some of the tougher measures on China, but it's not that way this go around, is it? Tell us a little bit about how you see Trump himself as a major player in the policy this go around, if you will.
Well, as you just noted, I'm not sure that Trump was a major player sometimes on these issues in the first term. So I remember I was on the transition team for Trump 1. And at one point, I was asked to write some documents on China and Asia. And I went back and I said, well, you know, what's the sort of theme? What's the guidance that you have? And they said, well, you know, just do whatever you think is best. And I think that was kind of the approach that the president took. He was less experienced than a lot of his advisors on foreign policy. And so he had a bunch of people around him who, especially on Taiwan issues, had, you know, decades and decades of depth all over the place, right? At the White House, he had John Bolton for a little while, who'd spent a lot of time thinking about Taiwan. He had people like Randy Shriver at the Defense Department. A range of people at the State Department who thought a lot about China and Taiwan. And I think he deferred to them a fair amount. In this second term, it's pretty clear that the president feels he's as experienced as anyone on foreign policy issues, and he's the guy in charge. And I think that's really the biggest difference between that first term and the second one. And so rather than him taking cues from his advisors on how to handle China, I think they're taking cues from him. And so what you're getting is sort of the Trumpian approach to Beijing, which, you know, in my view, has led to a little bit of unpredictability, but also is part of why it's very focused on deal making and less focused on sort of the strategic competition elements that were so clear under Matt Pottinger and team in the first term.
Zach, what should our policy to China be?
So I know everybody's got their own view on this. I think we've talked about this a little bit. My personal view is that the U.S.-China relationship in the short term is going to be very challenging. And we shouldn't shy away from that. That's just the reality. Our interests are different. It doesn't mean that we have to have conflict, but I do think we are going to have to be quite firm in pushing back against Chinese behavior that we think is dangerous, especially on issues like Taiwan. We need to be careful not to provoke tensions with China, but I think we have to be forceful in upholding our interests. And then in the longer term, I think we can hope that the relationship will improve, but I think realistically that's not going to happen while Xi Jinping is in power. And, I think one way to do that is for us to engage with the Chinese, but also make sure that we are strengthening the region in the Indo-Pacific in part so that we can protect the region against any undue influence from China, but also so that it shapes Chinese decision making. And, I think that's been a fundamental question for American strategists for a long time, going back to when you and I were in government. Do you think that China's strategy should drive our Asia strategy, or do you think that our Asia strategy should sort of drive our China strategy? And I'm in that second camp. If you want to get China right, you've got to get the region right first.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what does that mean practically speaking? I mean, does that mean, as some would suggest, continue to get out of our commitments or do less in Europe and in the Middle East? I mean, or tell us what it means to put South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and all these relationships first.
Yeah. So I do think we have a resourcing problem. I don't think it means that we have to walk away from Europe or walk away from the Middle East, but I do think we have to make some choices about the number or the amount of resources that we devote to the critical regions. And if it were up to me, I'd probably devote a bit more to the Indo-Pacific, because I think the Indo-Pacific is the place where deterrence is fraying the most quickly, and the place that if the U.S. doesn't stay engaged, the status quo could change really dramatically. But I don't think that means that you have to walk away from supporting Ukraine. I don't think it means that you have to pull U.S. forces from the rest of the world. I think it just is a question of the balance of investments. And then I think also the American people are somewhat more skeptical than they were decades ago about foreign involvement. And so part of this is also explaining to them that we're expending our resources carefully in places that matter. And that when we're expending our resources, we're getting something back. And I think if you look at our allies in Asia, look at Japan, South Korea, Australia, these are force multipliers, right? These are countries who, if we work with them, we get a lot back in return. And I agree with the Trump administration. We've got to make sure that we maximize those allied commitments to the extent feasible without fraying those relationships.
Okay, got it. All right, so resourcing is a big issue. Investing more time and interest into the region seems like also a resourcing issue. What about, let's go one by one. We don't have to get down into real details, but how are we doing on our relationship with Japan? And generally speaking, what are we asking them to do?
Yeah, I mean, as we do this, I think we're going to see a lot of the relationships are fraying a bit. The U.S.-Japan relationship is probably one of the relationships in the region that's in the strongest position. But we are asking Japan to spend a significant amount more money at a time that it is very politically sensitive for Japan to do so. The Liberal Democratic Party is selecting a new leader. That person will likely become prime minister in early October. And there are a lot of pressures on Japan domestically to cut back the consumption tax or to spend more money on social services. And so saying that Japan should spend, for example, 5% of GDP on defense is something that hasn't been particularly popular. And we've actually seen the Japanese prime minister come out publicly and sort of reject that request from the US. So there's definitely some tension in the relationship. And the Japanese have thus far avoided holding what the major alliance meeting, which we call a 2+2 meeting involving the defense and foreign ministers. That's been delayed and maybe now even canceled. And I think that's a sign of how frustrated they are. But, and here's the good news, I think at the end of the day, Japan is always going to be our anchor in Northeast Asia as long as we're present in the region. We need to be in Japan. Japan needs us there. So I think the foundation of the U.S.-Japan alliance is still solid, but we're starting to see some signals about, some Japanese leaders saying that they want to have more autonomy from the U.S., which, as an American, I think is a concerning sign.
Okay. And I have a feeling that the trade relationships, the things that the president is trying to accomplish, have put a real wrench into our relationship, not just with Japan, but also with Korea and other states. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you know, most of these countries, what they care about primarily is economic deliverables, right? They want to continue developing. And especially with, say, Korea, a lot of those economic tactics that the administration has taken recently have been really unpopular. Obviously, you've got the visa issue where we picked up 300 some Korean workers in the U.S. and sent them home. But now the H-1B issue, which will be a big problem with India and others. So those are going to be irritants along with the tariffs that the U.S. has placed on treaty allies. And, in a lot of key capitals, I think that's going to create some pretty long-lasting displeasure and maybe a little bit of a backlash against the United States.
Okay, gotcha. All right, let's go to Taiwan. This is the biggest issue, I think, and one that's constantly discussed. Is Taiwan successfully making itself into, as people like to call it, a porcupine? In other words, so inhospitable that the Chinese would never think of a cross-straits invasion because it would be so painful.
I don't think they're there yet. I think they're trying. But there are a lot of challenges, right? One is a domestic political challenge, which is that you've got three political parties in Taiwan. None of the three really have a shared view of what to do on the defense side, both on defense spending levels, but also on exactly what they should be spending that money on. You've also got a challenge, which is that it's not like Taiwan can just go and buy any system they want internationally. There are a very limited number of companies that will sell to Taiwan. And there's a huge backlog of systems, especially from the US, that Taiwan is supposed to get, in some cases that it's paid for and still doesn't have access to. So I think the Taiwanese leadership is trying to do a lot right now to address the challenges, to make themselves into a porcupine. The Minister of National Defense, Wellington Coos, I think has a pretty clear vision on this, but it is really hard when you can't just go on the open market and buy anything you want. So Taiwan's got some real challenges, and this is where I think we have to be realistic that Taiwan probably can't defend itself on its own. It needs a commitment from the U.S. It needs Japan to be involved potentially. That's the way that deterrence is going to hold.
So, Zach, this is where it gets to me, a political question, which is why should the United States care at the end of the day if Taiwan is taken by the Chinese? I mean, help me spell out an argument where, for example, I was talking to a Senate candidate recently, and he wanted to understand how he was going to explain this to people on the campaign trail. Help me break this down into why the American people should be worried about losing Taiwan.
I'm glad you asked this, because I think this is the biggest problem that we have right now on Taiwan issues domestically, is that we haven't done a good job explaining to the American people why Taiwan matters. So I think there are 4 reasons, and unfortunately, none of the 4 on their own convince the average person that they should fight for Taiwan. So I think the first one is the fact that from a security perspective, if Taiwan were to be taken by China, it makes it much more difficult for us to defend other treaty allies in the region, including Japan and the Philippines. They are just too close to Taiwan. And so that's why some people have called Taiwan sort of the cork in the bottle, holding back this greater Chinese presence that we'd see out into the first and even second island chains. Then you've got another rationale, which is purely economic. Taiwan is something like the 10th largest trading partner of the United States. And so if you were to take all that trade away, that's a huge loss for the United States. And it's absolutely critical in supply chains, which is related to a third issue, which is technology. As I think you and every one of your listeners knows, Taiwan is absolutely central on technology issues broadly. If you own an iPhone, the TSMC makes the most advanced chip in that phone, and almost all of those chips are produced in Taiwan. And so if you were trying to buy a car, any kind of computer, phone, advanced product that requires a microchip, there's a good chance that requires chips from Taiwan, which means that if you lose access to either TSMC or MediaTek or other companies in Taiwan, the entire U.S. economy would be terribly affected. Think of how hard it was to get a new car during COVID. That would be nothing compared to what would happen if we lost access to semiconductors from Taiwan. And then I think there's a final issue which will appeal to some people but not others, which is the fact that Taiwan's, an island of 23 million people. It has a really active democracy, and this idea that we shouldn't just stand by as that is snuffed out by an authoritarian system. So I think the challenge is you can walk through those arguments, the security argument, the economic argument, the technology argument, and that maybe broader values argument. My sense is that 25% of Americans kind of agree with most of those, but not one of those gets enough of a majority of Americans to say, yeah, this is something worth fighting for. And so I think you've got to have a really nuanced case to make about why Taiwan is important, and that's really hard politically.
We're going to take a quick break. We're asking listeners to take a short survey so we can serve you better. It's short, it's anonymous, and your input directly shapes what we cover, topics, guests, and how deep we go. If you work in government, at a think tank, or in the defense industry, your perspective is especially helpful. Tell us where more clarity and more depth would help your day-to-day. Please visit survey.bgsdc.com before Wednesday, October 8th, and share your perspective. Again, that's survey.bgsdc.com. Thanks for helping us continue to evolve this show, and we will be right back with more of our discussion with Zack Cooper.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
Let's get a little bit into what you believe are the timelines for a possible Chinese decision to make a cross-straits invasion. Can you review for us the Davidson window, when we believe that the Chinese might be ready militarily, and why don't you also mention where Xi Jinping is in his third term and whether you think this is a fourth term issue for him?
Yeah, so, the 2027 timeline has been something that's been talked about a lot. Your colleague Eric Sayers and I think we're having dinner with Admiral Davidson the day or the day after he made that fateful comment before the Congress. And I think his comments have been misinterpreted by most people. What I think he was trying to say is that when the U.S. military had done wargaming in 2026 or 2027, often those war games didn't go well. And I think a lot of people interpreted his comments as a statement that, on January 1st, 2027, the Chinese are going to come crashing across the strait. And I don't think that's at all what he meant. But the 2027 deadline has been politically helpful in driving resources. So it comes up again and again. But I just don't think that's how Xi Jinping is likely to think about a Taiwan scenario. So my guess is that if Xi Jinping was presented with a choice in which he felt he was backed into a corner. So I don't think this is going to happen, but you could imagine a Taiwanese leader formally declaring independence. If that happens tomorrow, I think Xi Jinping will go to war the next day. It doesn't matter if he's ready or not. The Chinese military, if you look back historically, has typically fought wars when it wasn't fully prepared. That hasn't stopped it before. So I think Xi Jinping could go tomorrow if he felt he had to. But my guess is that he can wait significantly longer than 2027 if it feels like the timing isn't right. And so I think our job is to say to Xi Jinping, look, the costs are just too great to do this today, and to convince him or other Chinese leaders to wait. And, there's a big debate about how long Chinese leaders could wait. Could they wait till 2035? Could they wait till 2049? I just don't think we know. I think our goal has to be let's try and get through Xi Jinping's time in power, and then we'll figure out what to do after that. So what does that mean we need to do in the short term? It means that we in Taiwan need to bolster deterrence as best we can to make clear that the costs of doing this would just be too high.
Well, let's go a little bit farther, though, into the nature of Xi Jinping. Isn't he the type of leader that will want this on his resume, if you will? Do you believe that this is something that he feels like he has to achieve?
So I think you're right that I'm sure he would love this on his resume. And, if you want to be in the pantheon of leaders like Mao, what better way to do that than by finally ending the Chinese Civil War and taking Taiwan? But I also think Xi Jinping probably doesn't want to leave office having launched a failed war against Taiwan and, potentially getting thrown out of office by the party or by the people. And so the costs for Xi, if this goes wrong, are really high. And so I'm sure the answer is that, yes, he would love to have control of Taiwan by the time he leaves power, if that's possible. But there's a big debate in the China community about whether that's something that he actually needs to do before he leaves power. And I just don't think we know. I think there's some evidence on both sides. And so I think the best we can do is make sure that the costs for him are high enough that he has to reconsider whether this is really worth it and whether, launching what could be a failed war is the last thing he wants on his resume.
So this will be superficial, but let's talk a little bit about the period of maximum vulnerability for Taiwan. Does it sound something like, well, he's not going to do it. Xi Jinping's not going to do it now. He's trying to revive the economy. He's trying to get the military ready. Then it's the end of his term. And the most propitious time would be, what do I hear, in the early 2030s? How does that match up? And do you believe he'll seek a fourth term?
So it's a fascinating question. I think the most dangerous time for Taiwan actually might be around 2028 or 2029. And the reason is that I think we should focus a lot more on the politics of what's happening in Taiwan. And you've got a presidential election in 2028 in Taiwan. There's a good chance that an opposition party could come to power, that the KMT could come back. And I think if the KMT came back to power, a lot of Chinese would expect some sort of progress or even a deal, a cross-strait deal between Taiwan and China. And I think there's a real risk that if the KMT1 didn't make a deal of that sort, that Xi Jinping would say, well, now there's no political solution anymore to the Taiwan problem. Now the only solution is going to be a military one. So I think you can lay out a case that if you're going to think about timelines, the one to really watch is something in 2028 or 2029. Now, on whether Xi Jinping seeks a fourth term, great question. I think all signs right now suggest that he may. But part of what's really hard is that we just don't know a lot about how a leadership transition would take place now. And the reason is that Xi Jinping himself got rid of basically the process for that transition. And so I think there are two pathways, just real quick, that you can imagine. One is that Xi, over time, slowly, he won't walk away overnight, but that he gives some positions to other people. And maybe he maintains control over the military. Maybe he takes on some different role, like, chairman of the party. But that he slowly provides more avenues for others to take leadership roles. The other is that he stays fully in control until the day he dies or is incapacitated or decides to walk away. And you can get really smart people on Chinese politics that will make an argument for both of those different cases. And so I think, unfortunately, we've got to prepare for both, which means just trying to watch what's going on in the Chinese system and being pretty flexible in our understanding of those two pathways.
As we begin to wrap up here, I'd love to get your take on the so-called axis of upheaval. This is the idea that China and Russia, of course, their no limits partnership, but add in there North Korea and Iran, are increasingly working together. Is this something we should really, really worry about, or does it sound superficial?
Well, it's funny, Michael. I think we've all had a lot of conversations about these things, and I don't think it was as real as people thought until maybe the Russians started cooperating so deeply with the North Koreans and Iranians in Ukraine. When you've got North Korean soldiers fighting against Ukrainians and you've got Iranian drones striking Ukrainian targets, it's pretty hard to argue that the cooperation among at least those three isn't real. And then the relationship personally between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin is very close. We just had the September 3rd Victory Day parade in Beijing, in which Putin and Kim Jong-un were there. So I think the Chinese, they don't want to get lumped in with North Korea and Iran, and probably even not with Russia. But I think it's pretty clear that they are, those relationships have tightened in recent years. And maybe there's not a full axis. There's a lot of distrust, especially between China and North Korea. But they have a lot of interests in common at the moment. And I do think that we have to pay very close attention to the increasing ties. And if there are ways to separate some of those countries from each other, drive wedges between them, that would be great.
I almost forgot to ask about North Korea, which is kind of a reflection of where the Washington conversation is. Do we have a North Korea policy, and what should it be? It feels like, I worked on this a lot in the Bush administration. It feels like we're just out of ideas.
I don't think we've had a North Korea policy for about 5 years. I think the policy in the Biden administration was to spend time doing other things because we just didn't think we could get a deal out of the North Koreans. And, it's pretty clear that the president would like to meet with Kim Jong-un. But at the same time, I don't think he's going to get a better deal than he got from Kim last time around. And the president, I think, rightly rejected that deal at the time. So the problem is North Korean nuclear weapons aren't going away. It's hard for me to imagine President Trump saying, okay, well, North Korea is a nuclear weapon state. We'll just live with that. And now we're going to make some other type of deal. So I think the U.S. is really stuck on North Korea. And this has been a problem across both political parties for, the last half decade at least.
Okay. Last question. In the South China Sea, the Chinese seem to be harassing the Philippines constantly. We've seen the video almost monthly. What should we be doing about that, if anything?
Well, My personal view is that we need to stand with the Philippines. And of course, part of that means making sure that we in the Philippines are very closely coordinated on what they do before they take any action in the South China Sea, so that we know what they're going to do and we're ready to respond if we're needed. But the Chinese are just blatantly violating international rules, right? They are doing things in the Philippines exclusive economic zone, which are pretty shocking. As an important side note, I would say they're allowing Vietnam to conduct massive land reclamation in the Spratly Islands, while they're barely allowing the Philippines to resupply food and water to Philippine Marines. So the Chinese strategy seems to be to try and press the U.S. and the Philippines apart, to wedge the two apart. And I think we've got to show that effort is going to be unsuccessful. And, that means taking some risk on the U.S. part, which, look, as a policymaker, you know this better than anyone, that's pretty hard when you have to go to the president and say, look, this is an area that could escalate, but here's the logic for doing that. I think President Trump at times has been willing to accept that logic, and at other times he's been more skeptical. And I don't think we know exactly where he lands on Philippines issues at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's right. Zack Cooper, thank you so much for joining NatSec Matters.
Thanks, Michael. Appreciate you having me on.
That was Zack Cooper. I'm Michael Allen. If you enjoyed listening to NatSec Matters, please leave us a rating and a review. We'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to be a sponsor, please email our team at bgs@bgsdc.com. You can also find this email in the show notes. Please join us for another episode next week of NatSec Matters.
NatSec Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. NatSec Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.